Greetings. This is a very special time of the year when I'm recording this message. We have a kind of double whammy. It is not normal to have 2 consecutive days of rest, 2 consecutive holy days, but once a year it does happen. It can happen more than that, but once a year it does happen each year, and that's where we have Sabbath and Pentecost. So one of the unique characteristics of the Festival of Pentecost, the Festival of Weeks, is that it must occur right after a weekly Sabbath, and therefore it does give us 48 hours to meditate, to rest, to think positive thoughts, to prepare spiritually for the next season ahead, the summer season, not yet upon us, but soon to be upon us. I want to take a look at look. Are you awake? Good. What I should have said is I want to take a look at Luke. I'm testing you. If you're awake then, and awake enough to turn to the verse, let's go to Luke 22, and here we see that at the last supper that he had with his apostles, as he's introducing the symbols of the New Testament Passover, which can be called communion, Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. The Bible refers to it, in, as far as I can see, in 2 ways, as the New Testament Passover, or in that sense the Passover, but we know of the New Testament, and also it refers to it as the Lord's Supper in the writings of Paul. But as he introduces the wine, he makes this comment. He says in verse 20, I'm going to quote his words from Luke 20. I'll read the introduction in Luke 22:20. Luke 22 and verse 20. Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." So he introduced them to the fact that the new covenant was coming. He was bringing the new covenant. Very important point. God had made an old covenant. Well, it was then the covenant. He had made a covenant with Israel at Sinai based upon promises he had made to the patriarchs. It was a very important covenant. It was a solemn pact. It's called a covenant in the Bible. Brit in Hebrew, the Ethike in the Greek. It's a beyond just a promise in a way. Of course, God's promise is sure, but this was a pact that he made, a solemn treaty to emphasize particularly the relationship that he had to these words that he had given. And today I want to talk about the divine covenants. I'm going to do a series on the subject for Pentecost season called the divine covenants, because Pentecost is called in Hebrew the Feast of Weeks, and the Hebrew word for weeks is very similar to the word for oaths. So there is one there's one literary work called the Book of Jubilees, very ancient literary work that talks of Pentecost as the Feast of Oaths or the Feast of Covenants. And actually, Pentecost does picture the ratification of the covenant at Sinai, the time when Israel made a commitment to God, God made a commitment to Israel, and it became a type of marriage, as we understand. Because of the failings of the Israelites, because they couldn't really be the kind of example they should have been, God said a new covenant was coming, and the new covenant would solve the problem of the old covenant, which is our nature. Our nature is the problem. The new covenant, in effect, refashions us, our nature. We are, in effect, reborn under the new covenant, so that we now have the understanding to fulfill our potential as human beings, and we have the will to do so, to refrain from what is wrong, to do what is right, and an understanding of what is right and what is wrong that is deeper and more profound than ever before. But the new covenant represents, in effect, the climax, or the apex of the covenants. But there are other covenants that God made, divine covenants, and I want to talk about them. As I said, this is in effect the Festival of Covenants. It pictures the old covenant, as we call it now, of Sinai, and then it pictures the new covenant that comes in force with Pentecost of I believe 31 AD. We don't have to quibble about exactly when, but let's say AD 31, the coming of the Holy Spirit in a dramatic way in Jerusalem on Pentecost. So we have the New Covenant then, the New Covenant Church beginning on Pentecost. Pentecost is in a sense the birthday of the Old Testament Church in a sense, and the birthday of the New Testament Church. Now, Jews customarily eat dairy products on Pentecost, and partly it's because they are beginning now their understanding of God's way of life. And as you know, we begin with the milk. As infants, we begin with the milk of the Word, then we go on to the meat. And there are other reasons also why, but so as a way to celebrate the beginning of the people of Israel as God's congregation. Of course, the Jews don't have the New Testament writings; they have only the Old Testament writings. So, to celebrate the covenant, the relationship of God to Israel, they have customarily been eating dairy products on that time. And it's interesting. Recently, I noticed that here in Central Florida, the Chabad movement on the Rabbinic Pentecost, Shavuot, the Rabbinic Pentecost, if you understand, if you've been following my talks, that the Rabbinic counting is different from what I believe is the actual biblical counting, as understood, I believe, by the apostles. And anyway, the Rabbinic counting brought Pentecost on the 6th day of the 3rd month, a few days ago. And on that day, around that time, the Chabad movement in where I'm living had an ice cream social. So that's one way to celebrate Pentecost. They had an ice cream social, among other things that they did. Well, I want today to celebrate this season by talking about the divine covenants. I gave a revolutionary talk. I didn't think it was, but it turned out to be back in 1988 when I talked about God's divine covenants. And I told the congregation there what I thought was very basic, that Christians are living under the new covenant. But for some people who were listening, it really created quite a stir, and there were side effects, I think, that I didn't really understand at the time. And unfortunately, some people misapplied what I had to say, I think, to some degree. And they thought that being under the new covenant meant that instead of being more effective in keeping God's law, that somehow it excused us from God's law, which we know, which isn't the point. But anyway, I talked then about the divine covenants. I have talked about them since, and it's taken me a while to mentally organize the material in a way that I think is appropriate. And now I do believe I have organized the material in a way that I think is appropriate. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. If you read about the divine covenants, you'll find different ways of dividing them up. But I obviously I like the way that I'm doing it, and I appreciate your feedback on it. Well, I want to go first to a prophecy in the book of Hosea, the 6th chapter. And here you see that God made a covenant with Adam. He made a covenant with the first human beings. So I call this the Edenic covenant. And the Edenic covenant was profound because Adam and Eve lived evidently in a peaceful environment where they didn't have to worry about nature. Nature was human beings' ally at that time. Animals evidently were not predatory in those days, because in the millennium they won't be. If you look at Isaiah 11 and other verses, Ezekiel 35, I believe it is. Maybe I should turn there. Here's Ezekiel. Okay, I'm in verse 35 and chapter 35, right? No, actually, I want probably verse 34. Okay, I'm in chapter 34. So Ezekiel chapter 34 is the one I'm looking for, where nature will no longer be a threat. And if you look at Ezekiel 34 and you also look at Isaiah 11, you'll see that it's talking about nature and it's talking about human beings. We won't have international strife, international competition. We won't have nations living as predators, as predatory animals. And even predatory animals won't be living as predatory animals anymore. They'll be at peace. There'll be peace in nature. And evidently that's the way it was in the beginning. And it will be so again. But because our ancestors, our first mother and father, our mother and father violated, rebelled against God, they in effect broke that covenant, and the world became very hostile to human beings in many ways. And evidently, based upon instruction I've received from a great Bible scholar who's no longer with us, but he believed that actually, we talk about today genetic engineering and how we come to the place where we can to some degree manipulate nature. He believed that Satan was given a certain leeway to so manipulate nature as to produce the kind of predatory world that it is today. God will restore a peaceful nature in the millennium. And in Hosea 6 and verse 7, he says, but like men, but if you look at the margin, it's like Adam. It's just like Adam. Like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt treacherously with me. So God made a covenant with Adam. And I believe it had to do with the fact that Adam was in a very wonderful environment where he could develop his potential without fear. He and Eve, our first parents. And God is going to restore that, as we see in Hosea 2. In the same book of prophecy, in Hosea 2 and verse 18, God says that in the future, in that day, in Hosea 2:18, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the air, and with the creeping things of the ground. Bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth to make them lie down safely. And I've also referred to Isaiah 11 and Ezekiel 34. So that ties in with this. So the time is coming when there will be world peace, but more than that, even the very environment will be harmonious and peaceful as it was in the Garden of Eden. I believe that what we see here is a restoration of the Edenic covenant, which unfortunately our ancestors broke. I want to now go to the 8th chapter of Genesis, and here we have the Noahide covenant, let's call it. The covenant that God made after the great flood, the deluge. Human life was wiped out. Much of animal life was wiped out. Not totally human life, because eight survived and certain animals survived. So we have the animals of today that inhabit the earth. And I don't want to get into a lot of the technicalities of the flood. That's for another day to talk about. I think that many people, misunderstand the account. We can get into that at another time. But I want to mention here what God says in verse 22 of Genesis 8. He says, while the earth remains, I'll go back one verse. And the Eternal smelled a soothing aroma. There was, of course, the sacrifice that Noah offered. And we know sacrifices point to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So all through the Bible we have sacrifices because Jesus Christ is so central to God's plan and to the new covenant that I began talking about at first. And the Eternal smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Eternal said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. So let's face it, we live in a world where Satan has a great deal of influence. If you read the Bible, you can see that, where there are demonic forces that have a great deal of influence. And so we have what we call, therefore, human nature. And we have a downward pull that we have to fight against. Now, most societies understand that that's the case, and so they institute certain laws and penalties for violating other people's rights, you could say, taking their property or hurting their person. And they teach children in most societies to behave themselves, so on. That's generally the case in civilized societies, as we would define them, that there are certain things done to support, to reinforce the positive side of our nature and to suppress the negative side, which we ought to know is there, which normally we would know is there. And in verse 22, God says, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. So he says there's going to be a normal cycle of nature from here on out, not a world-destroying flood. Now, at the end of human history, we do have a climax, of course. The world isn't forever, it's material. So there does come a climax I'll mention in a moment. But in chapter 9, he says, in verse 9, and as for me, behold, I established my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you, and every living creature that is before you for perpetual generations. He took the rainbow and he set it as a sign. I don't believe that means he created the rainbow then, but he set it as a sign. You know, just as the Sabbath is there in the book of Genesis, but later on we see it becomes a sign. Anyway, in verse 12, and God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you. Well, in a way, the Sabbath is always a sign, but it takes on an additional significance later on. But anyway, in verse 12, and God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. Verse 13, I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And I'll just read one more verse. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud. Verse 15, and I'll remember my covenant. I'm reading one more. And I'll remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. So we have God's guarantee that we're not going to be all flooded out as one time happened. But there is coming a time when there will be a disruption briefly in this day and night sequence. Evidently, there may still be a 24-hour period, but it would seem like it will be reversed and maybe somewhat murky, so that just for a brief moment, there'll be somewhat of a disruption just briefly to indicate where history has now reached a climax. Evidently, that's within the purview of this promise, that brief time when day and night are reversed, but then it does go back to normal quickly afterwards. But it's a sign of God's direct intervention in human affairs, and is found in Zechariah 14. So at the very end of this phase of human history, there is that brief disruption in the cycle in Zechariah the 14th chapter. Oh, I'm in Malachi. I need to go back a page or two. Okay. So it gives everybody a chance to catch up with me if you're not using a smart device, if you're flipping along in the Bible, in a book. I'm going to go to verse 6 in Zechariah 14. It shall come to pass in that day that there will be no light. The lights will diminish. It shall be one day which is known to the eternal, neither day nor night. But at evening time it shall happen that it will be light. So evidently there is a day, but somehow reversed from normal, and kind of ambiguous as far as our understanding. It will be a disruption, which is a sign that history has come to a close as we understand it, and now we have the dawning of a new time. And then the new time will again have day and night and so on, all going on along. There's another verse on that subject that I'll probably read later on. So we have this covenant with Noah that nature will continue on in the cycles that we're aware of, and that there'll be no great flood to destroy the earth. And there's a sign that when we see the rainbow, we would remember that covenant that God made. However, there is coming an end of the world as we know it, but not through water. It's coming through fire. And 2 Peter talks about that. I won't turn there because I covered it recently. So go back to my sermon on 2 Peter that I gave recently. And you'll read about what a famous American author called "The Fire Next Time." I think it comes out of an African American hymn, or what we used to call a Negro spiritual. The fire next time. You can read about it in 2 Peter. So the earth will be refashioned and remade, in effect destroyed and renewed, but by fire, not by water. Now that leads me to coming to God's plan of salvation. Since we had broken the covenant, our ancestors, since we had rebelled, and we had come to the point where human life itself was almost extinguished. We have 8 people and a new beginning. We also now have a new beginning to God's plan, and his plan is going to be successful. He is not going to be thwarted. He does intend to create a family, to have sons and daughters in his image. And so we have now the covenant with Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant. And we go to chapter 12 of Genesis. Now the Eternal had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house. So in effect, he crossed the Euphrates River and became known, if you look at Genesis 14, verse 13, I believe it is, he became known as Abraham, or Abram, the Hebrew, the Ivri, because he had crossed over the Euphrates River and gone west. And so because he had crossed over the Euphrates River, now he was a descendant of Eber, so that was a reinforcement of that. But besides being a descendant of Eber and then, of course, of Shem, no, I guess it's the other way around, of Shem and then of Eber. Yeah, Shem comes, of course, first. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We have Shem, we have Eber, and then down the line we have Abram. But he's also a Hebrew in the sense that he crossed over the Euphrates River, left Babylon behind. So in effect, he was baptized in a certain sense. He left spiritual Babylon behind, Ur of the Chaldees, and he crossed the Euphrates and headed for the Promised Land. Anyway, so now we see in Genesis 12, now the Eternal had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. So he promised national greatness to Abraham, because he had a very important responsibility for Abraham's descendants, to be an example. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. This is very critical here. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now ultimately that's spiritual. So we have here blessings that you could summarize by the English words race and grace. Abraham's descendants would be a great people. The ethnic group that descended from Abraham would ultimately be a great world power, evidently. But even more so, more importantly, that through Abraham's descendants, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, but particularly from the fact that the Messiah would come through Abraham, and so salvation would come through a descendant of Abraham. Now, he couldn't only be that. He had to also be divine. He had to be, as you'll see later, Davidic and divine, talking about Jesus Christ. So this is the covenant made with Abraham. Now, later on, a sign is given that to Abraham's descendants to remember this covenant. And Abraham does say he will bless Ishmael as God says he will bless Ishmael as Abraham's son, but he's going to establish his covenant supernaturally through Isaac, who will be born supernaturally. As Christ was born supernaturally, so was Isaac. And Isaac is the one through whom the covenant will be established. Verse 21 of Genesis 17. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. And he says earlier, he talks about the sign of the covenant. I'm going to go to verse 10 now. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. So if they're part of the community of Israel, if they live in an Israelite household under their control, they're to be circumcised, and circumcision is to be on the 8th day. Evidently, that is the time when it is safe to do it. So we do it as soon as we can, but we do it when it is safe to do it, on the 8th day. So circumcision on the 8th day, because that is when it is safe to do it. And you think about how do they figure that out? You know, it's really grotesque to think about it. You know, what a lot of babies died until they finally realized they should wait for 8 days. So this would seem to indicate there was a divine revelation. It ought to be on the 8th day. But, you know, that's just something to think about. But anyway, God told them that on the 8th day it was safe to do it. So as soon as it's safe to do it, do it. And so circumcision became a sign of that Abrahamic covenant. And we understand from this chapter and others that it was passed on to Isaac. And to save time, I will show, if you look at Genesis 27 and 27, you can see that it was then, or 28, you can see that it was then, actually 28 particularly, it was passed on to Jacob. And so it was to Jacob that this covenant was passed on. In Genesis 27, he receives the birthright, which is connected to it, the birthright blessing, a double portion from Isaac. And then in chapter 28 particularly, we see the entire package, in effect, that had been promised to Abraham, promised to Isaac, now it's promised to Jacob in chapter 28 of Genesis. And now we see it's carried out in the full sense to the nation, the 12 tribes of Israel, at the time of the covenant of Mount Sinai. And in the days of the Old Testament, before the coming of the New Testament church, the festival we're going to observe tomorrow would have been a festival commemorating the giving of the ratification of the Old Covenant. And just to, this is of course the fourth of the covenants that I'm going to talk about. And so if you want to come back on Pentecost, see how many there are, I'll try to finish it one way or the other tomorrow on Pentecost, God willing. I'll try to finish it tomorrow, but I will complete the thought today, or partly complete the thought today, by saying that on this weekly Sabbath before Pentecost, we remember what God told Israel in Exodus 19 in verse 5, Exodus 19:5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So we have the Decalogue given, which was probably given on the Sabbath before Pentecost, which that year was probably the 6th day of the 7th of the 3rd month, the 6th day of the 3rd month that year. And then we have, later on, we have the Book of the Covenant. Besides the 10 Commandments, you have Exodus 21, Exodus 22, Exodus 23, which of course includes the holy days, the holy day seasons. And tomorrow will be a holy day. It'll be a time to gather together. It'll be a time for an offering. It'll be a time for growing in understanding of God's Word. And finally, after the after the Book of the Covenant is given at Exodus 20, 21, 22, 23, then we have in Exodus 24, after those 4 chapters, we have then the ratification of the covenant. So I look in Exodus 24:7, we have blood sacrifices, just as Jesus gave his blood for the new covenant. We have blood sacrifices for the old. This is the Sinaitic covenant. This is the covenant at Sinai. Then he took the book of the covenant, speaking about Moses, and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Eternal has said we will do and be obedient. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. And so The doing causes us to hear. In Hebrew, the word hearing implies understanding. So they're saying, in effect, we'll do it, and over time, as we do it, we'll come to understand it. And it also means that over time, as you reveal more, we'll do that. If you look at what Israel said, they agreed that as more revelation came through Moses, God through Moses to them, they would do that, as you see through the Pentateuch here, through the Torah, through the 5 books of Moses. Verse 8, and Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Eternal has made with you, according to all these words. So we have the culmination of the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have the Abrahamic covenant now, in effect, reaching its culmination in the covenant with Moses and the children of Israel. But there are other covenants that God made, many in connection with this covenant I'm reading about at the moment, and I want to talk about that at a later time. But I want to conclude by something Moses said in Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter, when he repeated the 10 Commandments before they actually entered the land. And then we have the 10 Commandments expounded through much of the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. And then in verse 29 of Deuteronomy 5, it's actually quoting God himself. Deuteronomy 5:29. Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. So God says it would be wonderful if this group of Israelites that I've made this covenant with actually would have the kind of nature that would cause them to walk in these ways over the centuries and be the example that they need to be. Unfortunately, that was not the case. And so because of their problems, our problems as human beings, we needed, of course, the new covenant. And this is, of course, understandable. In order to develop a relationship with God, we want to have the most intimate possible relationship with God on the human level, and that means being converted and having his spirit. Remaining human, yes, but having God's spirit. And so in Hebrews 8 and verse 8, we read about the new covenant that was promised in Jeremiah 31. I want to go to Hebrews 8 and verse 7. All right, Hebrews 8 and verse 7. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second, because finding fault with them. You see, the covenant of God wasn't the problem. People were the problem. And we needed to be, in effect, regenerated, renewed, reborn. We needed conversion. These people as a whole were not a converted people. They were people that had made a commitment to be obedient, and they could have generally done so, on the human level. They could have generally been law-abiding, and many of them over the centuries have been. To this very day, there are many Jews who are, generally speaking, on the human level, loyal to the old covenant. They're still around, and that's to their credit. But generally speaking, people fall so short that in the long run, they're headed for destruction. They need a new mind and a new heart so that they can be potentially eternal. And so God says here, because finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming, says the Eternal, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And we also understand from verses in the Old Testament itself, and then certainly as it explained in the New Testament, that ultimately this agreement on a national level begins with Israel and Judah, but goes to the whole world. And for this period of history, during this time before the coming of Jesus Christ, it is being offered to first fruits from various nations. It isn't really a national matter in these years. It's a spiritual matter, and God selects from various nations those that will be part of the first fruits. That's another understanding we get from keeping Pentecost from year to year. It is a festival of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and shows that in the harvest that God is harvesting, there are first fruits. And the great harvest is yet ahead, but right now he's harvesting the first fruits. And he's harvesting the first fruits, applying to them the new covenant. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. So if you're listening to this on the Sabbath before Pentecost or on some other Sabbath, Shabbat Shalom to you. And if you're going to be keeping Pentecost tomorrow, I would hope you would listen to tomorrow's message, Chag Sameach to you. And let me say before I conclude that our hearts and our thoughts and prayers should be with the victims of these terrorist attacks that continue to plague our world. We've had problems in Manila that might have just simply been criminals without necessarily any ideological or religious agenda. I don't know yet about that. But then we've had the Afghanistan matter, and off and on, unfortunately, too often, we live in a world with these terrorist attacks. So please pray for those who are impacted by that. Please pray for protection for God's people as we gather together on the weekly Sabbath and for the holiday of Pentecost. And please pray for the coming of God's kingdom. All the best to you and yours.